The police burst into my bedroom at 2:15 in the morning, and I pretended I had no idea why. My wealthy neighbors peeked through their silk curtains as officers dragged me out in handcuffs. My wife stood in the driveway recording everything on her phone with a faint, satisfied smirk. But at the station, the lead detective opened my classified file, read 2 lines, and suddenly stood up straight. He looked at the guards, his voice shaking, and ordered them to remove my cuffs immediately. He turned to me, completely terrified, and asked a question that changed everything. I am Rick Stanton, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a retired forensic auditor for the United States Treasury Department, I thought I understood human toxicity, but I maintained absolute trust in my own home. Last month, my family hosted a lavish dinner to supposedly celebrate my legacy. Between expensive wine and toasted speeches, my wife leaned forward, smirking. "You know, Rick, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and began setting a trap. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Living in McLean, Virginia meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our 6-bedroom house, with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool, was a fortress of greed and hidden motives I could no longer ignore. The heavy oak double doors of my estate did not just open that night. They exploded inward with a deafening crash that shook the imported hardwood floorboards. Blinding flashlights cut through the darkness of my master bedroom before I could even sit up in bed. Angry voices yelled, demanding I show my hands and get on the ground. Before my mind could fully process the manufactured chaos, I was roughly pulled from my mattress, shoved hard against the cold, plastered wall, and heavy steel snapped tightly around my wrists. I am 70 years old. My joints ache on damp nights, and sudden violent movements send sharp pains shooting up my spine. But they handled me like I was a dangerous armed fugitive trying to flee the country. I did not resist them. I did not shout or angrily ask for a lawyer. I kept my breathing slow and steady, my face completely blank, as they marched me out of my own home. My bare feet stumbled over the expensive wooden floors I had installed just 3 years ago to make my wife happy. The cool night air hit my face as they dragged me down the sweeping concrete driveway. Red and blue police lights painted the quiet, exclusive neighborhood in chaotic flashes. I could see the silhouettes of my neighbors parting their curtains to eagerly watch my spectacular downfall. And there, illuminated by the flashing strobes, was the ultimate betrayal. The police lights bounced off the sleek, polished hood of the custom Aston Martin, parked near the garage. It was a car I had bought for my son Derek exactly 1 month ago to celebrate his promotion at his investment firm. Standing right next to that terribly expensive machine was Victoria, my loving wife of 12 years. She was fully dressed in designer clothes, completely awake, and holding her phone up with perfectly manicured hands. The camera lens was pointed squarely at my humiliated face. She did not scream for the officers to stop. She did not cry or frantically ask what was going on. Instead, the corner of her mouth twitched upward into a faint, victorious smirk. Derek stood right beside her. My own flesh and blood. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the son I had sent to the best universities in the nation. He stood there with his arms crossed tightly against his chest, staring a hole into the concrete, utterly refusing to meet my eyes. I realized right then, looking at the 2 people I had provided for and protected with my life, that this was not a terrible misunderstanding. This was a carefully calculated execution. The ride to the precinct was a blur of deafening silence and blinding streetlights. My mind raced in the back of the cruiser, piecing together the timeline, the arrogant smirks, the silent complicity of the people living under my roof. When we finally arrived at the station, they tossed me into a small, sterile interrogation room. The walls were painted a sickly pale green, lit by a buzzing fluorescent bulb that gave everything a harsh, unnatural glow. The metal chair dug painfully into my lower back. My wrists throbbed from the tight metal cuffs cutting into my skin, but I sat perfectly still. I did not demand my one phone call. I simply waited in the freezing room, letting the heavy, suffocating silence settle in. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy metal door clicked open. A man in a rumpled gray suit walked in, carrying a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the metal table with a dramatic thud and sat directly across from me. He introduced himself as Detective Harris. His eyes were tired, filled with the kind of smug, cynical judgment of a man who thought he had already caught his wealthy white-collar criminal. He leaned forward, folded his hands, and laid out the devastating charges. He told me I was looking at decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. According to the heavily forged documents in his folder, I had systematically embezzled $8 million from the Veterans Charity Fund managed by my wife. He listed off dates, wire transfer confirmation numbers, and offshore holding accounts located in the Caribbean. He confidently claimed they had my digital signature on every single illicit transaction, alongside the specific IP address of the desktop computer sitting right in my private home study. It was a neat, perfectly wrapped package of evidence, a masterpiece of a frame job designed to lock a retired real estate investor away forever. He pushed a piece of paper across the table toward me, a printed log of the wire transfers, and asked me with a mocking tone if I had anything to say before he handed me over to the federal authorities. I looked down at the paper, scanning the fabricated numbers, then looked calmly back up into his smug eyes. I told him he needed to look a lot deeper into my background file, the complete unredacted federal file, not the surface-level real estate portfolio my treacherous family thought was the entirety of my life. Detective Harris frowned, clearly annoyed by my absolute lack of panic. He aggressively pulled out his laptop, logged into the secure federal law enforcement database, and typed in my full name and social security number. I watched the blue reflection of the screen glow in his eyes as the page loaded. He scrolled down quickly at first. Then his scrolling stopped dead. He leaned much closer to the screen, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. I watched as the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking as if he had just seen a ghost standing behind me. His jaw literally slacked open. He read the lines again, running his finger across the screen, making absolutely sure his eyes were not deceiving him. Suddenly, he stood up so fast, his metal chair scraped violently against the linoleum floor, echoing loudly in the small room. He looked at the two uniformed officers standing guard by the door and yelled, his voice cracking with sudden, unmistakable panic. "Remove the cuffs right now!" The officers hesitated, looking at him in utter confusion. I said, "Take them off now," he roared. The officers rushed forward, fumbling with their keys, finally unlocking the heavy steel bands around my wrists. I rubbed my aching joints slowly, taking a deep, satisfying breath of the stale precinct air. Harris sat back down heavily, staring at me with a completely new expression. The arrogant cynicism was completely gone, replaced by absolute, terrified confusion. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet room. "Mr. Stanton," he began, his voice barely above a nervous whisper. "Your file shows you are a retired senior forensic auditor for the United States Treasury Department. It says you personally designed the automated anti-money laundering tracking software that the entire federal government uses today." He pointed a shaking finger at the fake evidence file sitting on the metal table between us. Why is a man who literally wrote the book on international financial tracking being framed for such a sloppy, amateur offshore wire fraud? I flexed my fingers, reached into my suit pocket, and calmly pulled out my personal phone. I unlocked the screen, bypassing the security protocols, and brought up the live encrypted server feed I had established weeks ago. I looked him dead in the eye and let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. "I have been waiting 3 months for this exact night, Detective. Now turn your laptop toward me. Let me show you who is actually going to federal prison before the sun comes up." To understand the sheer weight of what was about to unfold, you have to go back to the exact moment this nightmare began. Exactly 3 months ago, on a quiet Tuesday night, The autumn air was bitterly cold. I had gone to bed early fighting a mild tension headache. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up with a painfully dry throat. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress, feeling the familiar ache in my knees. I grabbed my heavy wool robe and stepped out into the dark, silent hallway, intending to get a glass of water. The house was completely still. Walking past the staircase, my eyes caught a pale slice of light spilling from beneath the door of my private study. That room was my absolute sanctuary. It was the nerve center where I managed my real estate investments and kept classified records from my service at the Treasury Department. No one was allowed in there without my explicit permission. Not my own son, and certainly not Victoria. I stopped breathing for a second. The security system for that room should have been fully armed. I moved silently across the thick Persian runner rug. I pressed my hand against the cool brass doorknob, turned it slowly to avoid the click, and pushed the door open just a few inches. What I saw inside made my stomach drop. The glowing monitor of my secure desktop terminal cast a harsh blue light across the dark room. Sitting in my high-backed leather chair, furiously typing, was my 38-year-old son, Derek. Standing right behind him with her eyes glued to the screen was my wife, Victoria. This image alone was deeply unsettling. For the 12 years Victoria and I had been married, Derek treated her with polite contempt. They barely spoke at family dinners. Yet here they were, huddled together in the dead of night, whispering frantically to one another, like seasoned conspirators. I pushed the heavy wood door fully open. It creaked loudly, and they both snapped their heads up simultaneously. Derek physically jumped, his hands flying off the keyboard. Victoria gasped sharply, her hand flying to her chest in genuine shock. I stepped into the room, keeping my posture relaxed and my voice level, and asked them what they were doing on my secure terminal in the middle of the night. For a fraction of a second, raw panic flashed brightly in Victoria's eyes. But she was a master of social recovery. In the blink of an eye, the panic vanished, replaced by a smooth, fabricated smile. She walked quickly over to me, wrapping her arms around my neck and pressing a kiss to my cheek. "We were trying to surprise you, honey," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You caught us red-handed. We are setting up a private charity foundation in your name for your 70th birthday next month. We wanted to have the framework ready to present to you at the party." Derek immediately chimed in, desperately recovering his broken composure. He picked up a stack of printed papers and held up an official-looking document. "Just helping Victoria sort out the complex IRS tax exemption codes, Dad. You know how complicated these federal filings can be. I was just reviewing the banking routing numbers for the initial endowment setup. We really did not want to wake you. You should go back to sleep." It was a brilliant, highly plausible lie. A beautifully constructed narrative designed to play directly to the ego and the vulnerable emotions of a proud, aging father. A normal 70-year-old man would have been deeply touched. He would have hugged his devoted wife, praised his hardworking son, and gone back to bed with a warm, full heart. But I am not a normal 70-year-old man. I spent 30 grueling years of my life sitting in freezing federal interrogation rooms, systematically breaking down some of the most sophisticated financial predators on Wall Street. I know the precise anatomy of a lie. I know exactly how the human body reacts involuntarily when a thief realizes the walls are closing in. As Victoria smiled so sweetly at me, I noticed the pitch of her voice was exactly a half octave higher than her natural speaking tone. Her pupils were blown wide open, dilated by a sudden spike of survival adrenaline. I looked past her shoulder to my son. Derek was holding the tax form casually, but his knuckles were stark white from gripping the paper so tightly. The overhead reading light caught a faint, unmistakable glisten of cold sweat on his trembling palms. He was breathing entirely from his upper chest, short and shallow, struggling to pull in enough oxygen. These were the exact same physiological tells I used to watch for when a corrupt hedge fund manager was desperately trying to explain away millions of dollars. They were absolutely terrified, and they were certainly not setting up a veterans charity. I needed them to feel completely safe. I needed them to believe that their masterful lie had worked perfectly. I needed to become the clueless old man they thought I was. So I let a warm, highly grateful smile spread across my tired face. I reached out and gently squeezed Victoria's arm. I looked at Derek with shining, proud eyes. "That is incredibly thoughtful of you both," I said, my voice thick with feigned emotion. "I am truly touched beyond words. I deeply apologize for interrupting your hard work. You are right, I should get back to bed. I will let you two finish your wonderful surprise." Victoria visibly exhaled, her tense shoulders dropping a full inch as the unbearable tension left her rigid body. Derek offered a tight smile and muttered a quick good night. I turned around slowly and began to walk out of the study, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. But just before the door clicked permanently into its metal frame, my eyes swept over the polished surface of my mahogany desk one last time. My encrypted flash drive. The physical hardware token that contains the master digital signature for all my global financial accounts is always placed on the top right corner of my desk. It is always aligned perfectly parallel to the straight edge of my dark leather mousepad. Always. As I looked through the rapidly narrowing gap of the closing door, the harsh blue light of the computer monitor illuminated that specific corner of the desk. The encrypted USB drive was no longer sitting parallel to the mousepad. It had been shifted exactly 2 millimeters to the left, and a tiny green indicator light on its metal side was blinking rapidly, indicating an active massive data transfer was currently in progress. My blood ran completely cold as the terrifying realization finally hit me. I clicked the heavy door shut, walked silently down the hall back to my dark bedroom, and sat heavily on the very edge of the mattress. They were definitely not setting up a charity for my birthday. My own wife and my only son had just successfully stolen the digital keys to my entire life. Sleep was completely impossible after that chilling discovery. I spent the remaining hours of the night lying flat on my back, staring at the dark ceiling, carefully slowing my heart rate. The anger burning in my chest was blinding, a hot and violent surge that demanded immediate confrontation. I wanted to march into the master bedroom, shake Victoria awake, and demand the absolute truth. I wanted to drive over to Derek's house and tear his office apart. But 30 years of dismantling complex financial frauds had taught me one undeniable lesson. Confronting a thief without possessing the complete map of their crimes only teaches them how to build better walls. If I showed my hand now, they would simply encrypt the stolen data, destroy the hardware, and pivot to a new strategy. I needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal before I tightened the noose. So when the morning sun finally broke through the curtains, I put on my most convincing mask. I walked down the grand mahogany staircase, feeling the familiar ache in my knees playing the part of the tired, oblivious retiree perfectly. I greeted Victoria in the kitchen with a warm smile, accepting the cup of black coffee she handed me with absolute calm. She was radiant, her movements light and relaxed, completely convinced that her midnight lie had worked flawlessly. I drank my coffee, read the morning paper, and waited for the next piece of the puzzle to present itself. It did not take long. Early that afternoon, a low, aggressive roar echoed down our quiet, tree-lined street. The distinctive, throaty growl of a high-performance engine shattered the suburban peace, drawing my attention to the front bay window. A brand-new, flawless, slate-gray Porsche 911 slowly rolled up my sweeping concrete driveway. The morning sun gleamed off its pristine ceramic coating. The driver's side door popped open, and my daughter-in-law Monica stepped out. She wore a pair of oversized designer sunglasses and an expensive silk blouse, carrying a leather handbag that easily cost more than a standard mortgage payment. I walked out onto the front porch, forcing a pleasant, welcoming expression onto my face as she strutted up the stone steps. She looked incredibly smug, running her manicured hand affectionately over the gleaming roof of the sports car. It was a beautiful machine. A quick mental calculation of the trim level and custom wheels put the sticker price right around $140,000. It was an extravagant, unapologetic display of wealth. Derek arrived 10 minutes later in his own vehicle, parking directly behind his wife's new toy. He walked up the steps looking slightly tense, his eyes darting toward the Porsche, before settling on me. We all sat on the back patio overlooking the heated pool, sipping iced tea in the warm afternoon air. I played the role of the proud patriarch, asking simple, open-ended questions to let them talk. I turned my attention to my son, my voice full of mild, supportive concern. I asked him how the investment firm was doing this quarter. I expected a boastful answer, something to match the stunning new car parked in my driveway. Instead, Derek sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck with a perfectly rehearsed look of deep fatigue. He told me the market was brutal right now. He complained about taking heavy losses over the past 3 months, claiming that several of his major client portfolios had tanked unexpectedly. He spun a very convincing tale of long hours, extreme corporate stress, and tightening budgets at the firm. He looked me right in the eye and said they were practically scraping by this quarter, waiting for the economic tide to turn. Monica sat right next to him, nodding in solemn agreement, sipping her tea with a perfectly staged look of spousal support. They were an excellent team. But as I watched them perform this incredibly sad routine, my internal alarm bells were practically deafening. My forensic instincts, honed over 3 decades of tracking hidden assets for the federal government, locked onto the glaring contradiction. A struggling investment firm manager, who is taking heavy, devastating losses, does not authorize his wife to go out and drop $140,000 on a brand new luxury sports car. Especially not a car that lacked permanent dealership tags indicating a full immediate cash purchase rather than a standard lease agreement. The math was completely fractured. The narrative was fundamentally broken. They stayed for another hour, chatting amiably with Victoria about trivial neighborhood gossip. I smiled, nodded, and offered sympathetic advice about enduring tough financial markets. I watched them drive away, the powerful roar of the Porsche echoing mockingly down the street. The second their taillights disappeared around the corner, I walked directly back inside the house, bypassing the compromised computer in my study. I headed straight for the basement utility closet, a dusty, forgotten room where the main fiber optic internet line entered the estate. Hidden behind a stack of old cardboard boxes and winter coats was a secondary, heavily encrypted server I had personally wired into the network architecture years ago. It was a failsafe, a phantom node that did not show up on any standard network scan. Victoria and Derek had absolutely no idea it even existed. I pulled a small, rugged laptop from a locked steel case, connected a physical Ethernet cable directly into the hidden proxy switch, and powered up the system. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing command lines with a muscle memory that had never truly faded. I bypassed the standard user interface and dove directly into the raw back-end routing logs of my home network. I isolated the traffic from the exact time frame when I had caught them in my study. 2 a.m. I ran a deep packet inspection, searching for any trace of the IRS tax exemption codes Derek claimed to be researching. I looked for digital applications for the charity foundation Victoria had so sweetly described. There was absolutely nothing. No federal tax forms, no nonprofit registry searches, no innocent birthday surprises. Instead, what I found made my jaw clench in cold, focused anger. The logs showed a massive, aggressive, brute force ping. It was a sophisticated digital attack designed to silently bypass my external firewall and establish a secure, untraceable tunnel. I traced the outbound destination of that tunnel. The data packets were not routing to the United States Internal Revenue Service. They were bouncing through 3 different virtual private networks before finally terminating at a highly secure private banking server located in the Cayman Islands. They had connected my stolen digital signature directly to an offshore holding company, a notorious tax haven specifically designed to hide vast amounts of untraceable wealth. They were moving money, massive amounts of it. But the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle was not where the data was going. It was exactly where the data was coming from. I ran a reverse trace on the local area network, tracking the origin point of the brute force attack right here inside my own house. The malicious commands had not originated from Derek's phone or a compromised external device. I stared at the blinking green cursor on my screen, feeling a heavy, sickening weight settle deep in the pit of my stomach. The specific media access control address running the illegal offshore script belonged to one single piece of hardware. It was registered directly to Victoria's personal silver MacBook, the laptop she used every single day to browse recipes and email her friends, the laptop sitting upstairs on our shared kitchen counter. My brain spun as I processed the terrifying reality of that digital footprint. My wife was not just a passive participant in my son's desperate financial crimes. She was the one actively hosting the secure connection. She was the one hacking my network alongside him. I sat in the dim light of the basement, surrounded by humming servers, asking myself a question that chilled me to the bone. Why was my wife secretly building an offshore financial fortress with my son? I could not simply confront them. Confrontation, without a meticulously constructed steel trap, is just an open invitation for seasoned criminals to completely hide their illicit tracks and burn the evidence completely. The next morning, I limped heavily into the pristine kitchen, leaning awkwardly on the massive granite island. I forced a painfully convincing grimace, aggressively massaging my lower back and my right knee to perfectly sell the daily performance. Victoria looked up from her morning tablet, her perfectly sculpted face instantly painting a deeply flawless picture of absolute dutiful concern for my well-being. I told her the damp autumn weather was completely locking up my aging joints. I said I could not physically endure another month of this creeping agony and that my specialist doctor had strongly recommended an intensive 2-week physical therapy retreat down in Boca Raton, Florida. I made a specific point to sound utterly exhausted, like a broken, fragile old man desperately seeking a quiet, comfortable escape from his daily misery. I told her the wellness retreat explicitly prohibited cell phones and laptops to encourage complete digital detox and deep psychological relaxation. I clearly stated I would be leaving all my electronics, including my highly encrypted work laptop, right here in the quiet security of the house. The brief, triumphant glance she instinctively shot toward the hallway, where I knew Derek was standing, was all the confirmation I needed. They practically packed my leather travel bags for me. 2 days later, I kissed my treacherous wife goodbye, got into an airport shuttle van, and rode it exactly 3 blocks before asking the confused driver to pull over to the curb and let me out immediately. I did not go to the airport, and I certainly did not go down to Florida. Instead, I walked into a severely nondescript, weathered brick apartment building where I had quietly rented a ground-floor unit under an untraceable corporate shell name earlier that week. The apartment was entirely bare, except for a cheap plastic folding table, a remarkably uncomfortable metal folding chair, and several thousands of dollars in high-grade tactical server equipment I had procured through incredibly discreet channels. I drew the heavy dust-covered blackout curtains tight against the afternoon sun and immediately began assembling my actual workspace. I reached out to a secure private contact, a brilliant former Treasury Department cybersecurity specialist, who owed me a massive life-saving favor from our intense days tracking ruthless cartel money through shady Miami shell corporations. I did not give him the full humiliating family dynamic. I simply told him I urgently needed a blind, untraceable routing mirror to securely overlay my personal home network. I spent the next 48 uninterrupted hours writing complex, self-executing code, fueled entirely by bitter black coffee and a cold, sustaining fury burning deep within my soul. I was not going to arbitrarily block their access to my financial servers. I was going to gladly hold the heavy vault door wide open for them to enter. In the complex world of federal forensic auditing, we call it a honeypot. It is a highly deceptive, perfectly mirrored digital environment designed to look exactly like the real target, meant to quietly lure ambitious attackers in and trap them while they foolishly think they have successfully breached the main vault. I meticulously crafted a flawless digital duplicate of my primary financial holding accounts, ensuring that the visual layout was absolutely indistinguishable from the actual database. I deliberately placed my secure digital signature protocol right where they could easily find it, intentionally downgrading my own internal firewall just enough to make them feel brilliantly accomplished, without making it look too incredibly suspicious. But I completely rigged the outgoing international transfer protocols. When they used my stolen signature to authorize the movement of funds to their secure Cayman Islands account, the money would indeed move. But it would secretly bounce through a heavily monitored Internal Revenue Service tracking tripwire before making the final, irrevocable jump overseas. This hidden automated loop would legally flag the entire illicit transaction as a Level 1 federal threat, stamping a permanent, indelible digital watermark directly on the offshore receiving account. They truly thought they were quietly slipping millions into the dark. In reality, they were painting a massive glowing federal bullseye squarely on their own backs. With the trap perfectly laid, I logged into the hidden high-definition microcameras I had secretly installed in the crown molding of my private study the day before I faked my sudden departure. I sat alone in the dark apartment, my tired eyes glued to the glowing monitors. For 3 agonizing silent days, absolutely nothing happened. Then late on a rainy Friday night, the silent motion sensor alert aggressively flashed on my main screen. The live video feed from my study abruptly flickered to life. Derek walked into the room moving with the eager, frantic energy of a starving man finally seeing food. Victoria followed closely behind him, quickly locking the heavy oak door. They sat down together at my mahogany desk, eagerly opening the laptop I had so conveniently left behind. I watched my son's fingers fly rapidly across the illuminated keyboard. Through my secondary tracking monitor, I watched the live network traffic spike. They took the bait perfectly. They easily found the mirrored gateway, confidently bypassed the simulated firewall, and eagerly seized my secure digital signature. I watched the green progress bar on my screen slowly fill as they initiated a massive, irrevocable international wire transfer. $8 million. It was nearly the absolute entirety of my liquid capital. The transaction finalized and completed. The screen flashed a bright, solid green approval notification. Derek slumped back heavily in my leather chair, letting out a massive breath of pure, unadulterated relief. Victoria actually clapped her hands together, a silent, joyful celebration of their success. She walked purposefully over to the mahogany bar cart in the corner of my study, pulled out an expensive bottle of vintage champagne I had been saving for our anniversary, and popped the cork. She poured 2 crystal flutes, handing one directly to my son. They clinked their elegant glasses together happily, toasting to their incredible newfound wealth and my absolute devastating ruin. I watched them celebrate their victory, feeling a highly toxic mixture of profound grief and boiling, uncontrollable rage bubbling up inside my chest. Then the locked door of the study suddenly clicked open. My daughter-in-law Monica stepped confidently into the room. She was wearing her incredibly expensive designer coat, looking around the illuminated study with a sharp, calculating gaze. She walked directly over to Victoria, casually took the crystal flute of champagne right out of her manicured hand, and took a long, slow sip. She swallowed smoothly, handed the glass back, turned her cold, empty eyes directly toward Derek, and asked a brutal question that made the blood run entirely cold in my veins. "Are you absolutely sure the old man will take the full fall for this operation? I really do not want to go to a federal prison because your dad was always far too smart for us to manipulate so easily." I stared at the monitor, my breath catching in my throat, as Monica's cruel question hung in the air of my study. She stood there casually sipping the vintage champagne I had bought for my anniversary, looking at my son with cold calculation. I adjusted the volume on my receiver, dialing it up until the crystal-clear audio from the hidden microphones filled my dark apartment. I wanted to hear every single syllable. I needed to hear the exact justification my own flesh and blood would use to completely destroy my life. Derek laughed. It was a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed through the hidden speakers, sending a profound chill down my spine. He leaned back in my leather chair, swirling his drink, completely comfortable in the space he was currently violating. "You worry entirely too much, Monica," he said smoothly. "The old man is completely oblivious. He thinks we are throwing him a surprise party. The digital signature protocol is entirely foolproof. We did not just move $8 million into a random account. We wired it directly into an illicit offshore gambling ring based in Macau, and we did it entirely under his verified identity using his private network and his personal encryption keys. I felt a physical wave of nausea wash over me. They were not merely stealing my liquid capital to fund their extravagant lifestyle. They were actively constructing a flawless federal trap. As a retired forensic auditor, I knew exactly what moving funds to a sanctioned gambling syndicate meant. It triggered immediate anti-terrorism and racketeering protocols within the federal government. It was a guaranteed federal indictment. Victoria smiled, tracing the rim of her crystal flute with her manicured finger. "The Treasury Department will flag the transfer by tomorrow morning," she murmured, sounding thrilled by the prospect. "Once the federal agents trace the digital footprints back to this specific router and verify the authorization signature, they will raid this house. They will arrest him before he even knows what hit him. He will not be able to defend himself because the digital evidence is absolutely undeniable." My chest tightened with a suffocating pressure. I had spent 30 years of my life building a pristine reputation serving my country and hunting down the exact type of criminals my family was currently imitating. Now my wife was gleefully counting down the hours until a tactical team kicked down my door. But Derek was not finished. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on my mahogany desk, and delivered a blow that shattered whatever remaining illusion of fatherly hope I still harbored. "It is the perfect exit strategy," Derek explained, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy. "The old man lived too long anyway. Once he is locked up, the state seizes the dirty assets connected to the gambling ring. They will immediately freeze his accounts, but we will have already cleaned the bulk of his remaining estate through the fake charity foundation. We get the millions, and he gets a tiny federal cell for the rest of his miserable life." I closed my eyes, letting the sheer brutality of his words wash over me. This was my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had proudly watched graduate from college. He was casually discussing my death in a federal penitentiary as if it were a brilliant corporate merger. He did not care about the humiliation, the terror, or the physical toll a prison sentence would take on a 70-year-old man. He only cared about liquidating my life's work and removing me from the equation completely. I looked at the screen, observing the three of them celebrating their masterful deception. Victoria leaned over and kissed Derek on the cheek, congratulating him on his brilliant strategy. Monica raised her glass, proposing a toast to their imminent freedom and massive wealth. They were a unified front of pure malice, entirely comfortable with the horrific fate they had just assigned to me. The anger that had been simmering in my gut instantly hardened into something entirely cold and unbreakable. I was no longer a grieving father or a betrayed husband. I was a trained investigator dealing with hostile financial predators. Suddenly, the celebratory mood in my study was interrupted by the sharp, piercing ring of a cellular phone. Victoria quickly set her champagne glass down on the desk and pulled a cheap, disposable burner phone from the pocket of her designer jacket. I instantly recognized the significance of that device. A woman who carried a $1,000 handbag and the newest smartphone did not carry a prepaid plastic burner unless she was communicating with someone deeply embedded in the criminal underworld. She looked at the screen, her eyes widening slightly, and immediately held a finger up to her lips, signaling Derek and Monica to be completely silent. They instantly froze, their triumphant smiles fading into tense anticipation. Victoria tapped the screen to answer the call and deliberately pressed the speakerphone button, allowing the audio to broadcast clearly across my quiet study and directly into my hidden microphones. "Is it done?" a voice rasped from the tiny speaker. I stopped breathing. I leaned closer to my monitors, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. The voice was heavily distorted by the cheap speaker, but the cadence, the deep, gravelly timbre, and the distinct, dragging pronunciation of the consonants were utterly unmistakable. It was a voice I had not heard in 5 years, a voice that belonged to a man who was supposed to be permanently exiled from the United States of America. "Yes," Victoria answered, her tone suddenly shifting from arrogant confidence to submissive respect. The transfer just cleared the final security gateway. $8 million is sitting comfortably in the holding account. The digital trail points directly back to his personal network exactly as you instructed. We executed the plan flawlessly. Excellent, the gravelly voice replied, accompanied by the faint, distinct sound of a lighter clicking and a slow exhale of smoke. The federal tripwires should engage shortly. Make sure you are completely clear of the blast zone when the authorities arrive to collect him. I will begin moving our funds through the secondary washers immediately. You did well, Victoria. A sick, twisted knot formed in my stomach. The puzzle pieces suddenly shifted, revealing an entirely new, deeply terrifying picture. This was not merely a greedy family plotting to steal an inheritance. This was a highly coordinated, professionally executed strike orchestrated by an external threat. And I knew exactly who was pulling the strings on the other end of that phone line. The voice echoing through my dark apartment belonged to a man named Leo. He was Monica's older brother, a ruthless, incredibly dangerous convicted felon who had operated a massive syndicate of illegal wire frauds before I personally assisted the federal government in dismantling his operation and securing his deportation 5 years ago. I had completely ruined his criminal empire, and now he was using my own wife and son to enact his ultimate revenge. They thought they were the masterminds of this entire operation, but they were complete fools. I sat completely paralyzed in the dimly lit apartment, staring at the glowing monitors, while the chilling reality of that raspy voice echoed through my mind. Leo was not just a common thief. He was an apex predator in the global financial underworld. Years ago, I had personally handed the federal authorities the exact routing maps they needed to dismantle his sprawling network of offshore shell companies. I watched the marshals lead him away in heavy iron chains. I watched the judge sign his deportation order. I thought the absolute nightmare he had brought upon the financial sector was permanently finished. But I had drastically underestimated the depth of his vindictive patience. He had not simply disappeared into the shadows of international exile. He had spent half a decade meticulously cultivating a devastating revenge strategy, embedding his poison directly into the very foundation of my own family. Monica was not merely a greedy daughter-in-law pushing my son toward corporate theft. She was the active embedded handler for a deported cartel operative. She was the vital bridge connecting my vulnerable, arrogant son and my treacherous wife to a sophisticated international syndicate. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I initiated a highly classified audio tracing protocol I developed during my final years at the Treasury. The burner phone Victoria was using operated on a heavily encrypted frequency, but Leo was arrogant. He was broadcasting from a static satellite relay, assuming geographic distance would mask his digital footprint. Within 3 minutes, my proprietary software sliced through his elementary security layers and pinpointed the exact origin of the transmission signal. The longitude and latitude coordinates populated on my screen in stark white text. He was broadcasting from a private, heavily fortified coastal villa located in Nassau, Bahamas. The pieces of this horrifying puzzle snapped together with a sickening clarity. This was never a simple family coup. This was a hostile takeover orchestrated by a deeply entrenched, organized crime syndicate operating freely right inside my own living room. Victoria and Derek truly believed they were independently stealing my wealth to fund their lavish lifestyles. They believed they were using Leo to safely wash the stolen capital. But they were nothing more than highly expendable, foolish pawns in a much grander, infinitely more malicious execution. Once the money officially cleared the final international gateway, Leo would immediately sever all digital ties, drain the offshore accounts, and leave my wife and son entirely exposed to the unyielding wrath of the federal government. He was using their unparalleled greed to orchestrate my physical destruction and their ultimate legal ruin simultaneously. I needed to act with absolute surgical precision. If I triggered a massive federal alarm right now, local authorities would storm the house. Leo would vanish into the international wind with my $8 million, and my reputation would still be completely destroyed in the ensuing chaotic media spectacle. I needed a ghost. I needed a man who understood the intricate, invisible mechanics of international banking law better than anyone else alive. I reached for my encrypted satellite phone and dialed a private unlisted number I had not called in nearly 3 years. The line rang twice before a sharp, distinctly professional voice answered the connection. It was Jonathan Bradley. Jonathan was my former counsel, a brilliant, exceptionally ruthless attorney who specialized exclusively in offshore asset recovery and silent international corporate litigation. I bypassed standard pleasantries and laid out the exact parameters of the crisis. I told him my master signature had been compromised from within my home, and a hostile transfer of $8 million was currently navigating the international wire protocols toward a Cayman Islands holding company, controlled by a deported felon. Jonathan listened in absolute, terrifying silence. When I finished detailing the scope of the syndicate infiltration, his response was immediate and incredibly cold. He did not waste a single second offering hollow sympathy regarding my family. He simply asked for the specific routing numbers and the exact destination registry. I read the alphanumeric codes directly from the active tracing log on my monitor. Jonathan explained the tactical strategy with military precision. We could not simply cancel the massive transaction. If the funds abruptly stopped moving, Leo would instantly realize the secure connection had been compromised, and he would order Victoria and Derek to immediately destroy all the physical hardware in the house. We needed to let the syndicate believe they had achieved absolute victory. Jonathan initiated a highly classified banking maneuver known as a silent digital quarantine. He possessed the rare legal authority to contact the central clearinghouse in the Cayman Islands and place a frozen invisible lock on the specific receiving account. The transfer would appear completely successful on Leo's monitoring software. The holding company dashboard would actively display the full $8 million balance shining brightly in solid green text. But the absolute second Leo attempted to move even a single dollar out of that account, the funds would mathematically evaporate into a secure, untouchable federal escrow vault. It was the ultimate financial phantom trap. We would let them celebrate their stolen wealth entirely unaware that they were holding a digital mirage. Jonathan assured me the silent freeze would be fully active within the next 20 minutes. He told me to stay completely off the main networks and wait for his confirmation signal. I sat in the dark, silent apartment, listening to the soft hum of the cooling fans on my tactical servers. The adrenaline that had been surging through my veins slowly began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache of profound betrayal. I watched the live video feed from my study. Victoria, Derek, and Monica were currently pouring a second round of the expensive vintage champagne, laughing carelessly as they discussed what specific luxury properties they were going to purchase once my impending federal arrest was officially announced on the local evening news. My own wife was happily drinking, to my absolute destruction. Exactly 35 minutes after I concluded the call with Jonathan, a secure, encrypted email notification suddenly flashed across my primary monitor. It was a direct priority message from his private offshore server. The subject line was completely blank. I quickly opened the encrypted digital file, expecting a standard banking confirmation document, verifying the successful implementation of the silent offshore account freeze. Instead, the attached file was a high-resolution surveillance photograph taken by one of Jonathan's elite corporate operatives currently stationed in the Caribbean. I stared at the crisp digital image, feeling all the air violently leave my lungs. The photograph showed a sunny, brightly lit outdoor patio at a highly exclusive, terribly expensive seaside cafe located in Nassau. Sitting together at a small, intimate corner table was Leo, looking exactly as ruthless as I remembered. And sitting directly across from him, leaning intimately over the white table, was my loving wife, Victoria. She had her hand placed affectionately over his. They were sharing a passionate, undeniable kiss. Last month, Victoria had packed her designer luggage and explicitly told me she was going on a quiet, relaxing 2-week wellness spa trip to the mountains of Colorado to clear her mind. I stared at the surveillance photograph on my encrypted monitor, feeling the last remaining fragments of my 12-year marriage instantly turn to ash. The sheer gravity of the deception hit me with the force of a physical blow. Victoria was not merely a greedy wife looking for a quick payout alongside her ambitious stepson. She was deeply romantically entangled with a ruthless international criminal. The pieces of this horrifying puzzle finally snapped together, forming a picture so depraved it defied human decency. Leo was not just using my family. He was sleeping with my wife. Monica was his biological sister, acting as the crucial bridge inside our home. And my son Derek, the boy I had raised and protected, was nothing more than a spectacular fool. He was the perfect, oblivious pawn. They were using his monumental greed and his desperate desire for wealth to facilitate the theft. The ultimate plan was painfully obvious now. They would use Derek to hack my terminal, wire the $8 million to Leo, and perfectly frame me for the federal crimes. Once the authorities dragged me away in handcuffs, Victoria and Leo would simply vanish with the cash, leaving Derek holding the bag for the remaining domestic fallout. My own son was actively digging my grave, completely unaware that his beloved wife and his treacherous stepmother had already dug a second one right next to it just for him. I tore my eyes away from the damning photograph and looked back at the live video feed streaming from the hidden cameras inside my study. The celebratory atmosphere in the room was beginning to shift. Derek was pacing nervously back and forth across the Persian rug, rubbing his temples. He muttered something about needing to clear his head, claiming the adrenaline from bypassing the federal firewall was making him incredibly anxious. He told Victoria and Monica that he was going to take the new Porsche for a long drive down the coastal highway to calm his nerves before they finalized the last batch of domestic transfer documents. Victoria walked over to him, placing her hands gently on his chest, playing the role of the supportive conspiratorial matriarch to absolute perfection. She praised his brilliant computer skills, assuring him that the hardest part was officially over. I watched my son nod, completely intoxicated by her toxic validation. He grabbed his coat and walked out of the study. A few moments later, the heavy thud of the front door echoed through the audio feed, followed by the distant, aggressive roar of the sports car engine firing up in the driveway. The absolute second the engine noise faded down the street, the entire dynamic inside my private study completely transformed. Victoria and Monica stood in the center of the room, listening intently until they were absolutely certain Derek was gone. Then the warm, familial smiles melted off their faces like cheap wax. Victoria walked back over to my mahogany desk and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sent a fresh wave of cold fury rushing through my veins. "I cannot believe how unbelievably easy it is to manipulate that pathetic boy," she sneered, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "I spent 3 months slowly feeding his massive ego, planting the seed that he deserved your father's wealth more than anyone else. He practically begged me to help him steal it." Monica chuckled darkly, pouring herself another glass of my vintage champagne. "My brother said Derek was the perfect idiot for this operation," she replied smoothly. "He is just smart enough to bypass the basic security routers, but far too arrogant to realize we are setting him up to take the secondary fall. Leo wants the old man rotting in a maximum security federal cell for ruining his empire 5 years ago. But he wants Derek destroyed for simply being a weak, pathetic husband." Victoria nodded in cold agreement, sitting back down in my leather chair. She casually dismissed 12 years of our marriage with a careless wave of her manicured hand. "I have played the dutiful, loving wife to that boring, paranoid old auditor for over a decade," she said bitterly. "I deserve every single penny of that $8 million. Tomorrow morning, when the federal agents raid this house and drag Rick out in chains, Leo and I are getting on a private charter flight to Nassau. Derek can stay behind and explain to the federal prosecutors why his digital fingerprints are all over the secondary network servers. He will be indicted within a week." I sat in the dark apartment, my hands balled into tight fists, listening to the sheer, unadulterated malice radiating from my own home. They were not just stealing my money. They were weaponizing my entire legacy. Victoria leaned forward and woke my computer screen back up. She dragged the mouse across the digital desktop, opening a series of highly classified folders I kept stored on the local drive. Through my cloned monitor feed, I watched her pull up perfectly fabricated Internal Revenue Service tax exemption forms and fraudulent charity endowment certificates. They had prepared everything in advance. Monica leaned over Victoria's shoulder, pointing at the bottom of the digital documents. Victoria clicked a specific file containing the heavily encrypted digital signature they had stolen from my secure flash drive just an hour earlier. With a few swift, practiced motions, she systematically dragged and dropped my verified signature onto exactly 14 different illicit documents. She was actively forging a massive paper trail officially linking my personal identity to a vast network of phantom holding companies and offshore gambling syndicates. Every single click of her mouse was another nail in my manufactured coffin. I watched my wife effectively sign my life away, expertly building a mountain of undeniable, catastrophic evidence that would absolutely ensure I never saw the outside of a federal penitentiary ever again. They were incredibly thorough, leaving a meticulously crafted trail of breadcrumbs for the federal investigators to easily follow directly to my doorstep. Just as Victoria finished saving the final forged document to my local hard drive, a sharp electronic chime echoed through the silent study. The sudden noise came directly from the cheap, disposable burner phone sitting right near my keyboard. Because I was actively monitoring the entire local area network through my hidden proxy, my tactical server instantly intercepted and cloned the incoming cellular data packet. The short message materialized in bright white text across my secondary monitor, a fraction of a second, before Victoria even picked up the physical device. It was an urgent, highly encrypted text message coming directly from Leo in the Bahamas. I stared at the glowing words on the screen, feeling the sudden, massive acceleration of the impending collision. I realized the true depth of their betrayal and the terrible danger I faced. The text read, "The feds are sniffing around the holding account much faster than we anticipated. The silent quarantine protocols have been abruptly triggered. We have to drop the hammer tonight before he figures it out. Call the anonymous federal tip line immediately and report the old man right now." The terrifying trap was finally springing shut. I watched the intercepted text message burn into my monitor, the chilling reality of Leo's command solidifying. The trap was springing shut. On the live video feed from my study, Victoria did not hesitate. She read the incoming text from her deported lover, locked eyes with my son and her daughter-in-law, and gave a sharp nod. Derek swallowed hard, his face pale with apprehension, but he did not stop her. Monica stepped back, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Victoria lifted the cheap plastic burner phone, took a deep breath to steady her pulse, and dialed the anonymous federal law enforcement tip line. What happened next was a spectacular display of sociopathic acting. As soon as the federal operator answered, Victoria's confident posture collapsed. Her voice began to shake violently, cracking with manufactured terror and perfectly timed, breathless sobs. She told the operator she was a terrified spouse who had just stumbled upon something horrific on her husband's computer. She claimed she had found highly illegal offshore banking transfers, massive amounts of money routed to international gambling syndicates, and undeniable evidence of a sprawling money laundering ring. She wept convincingly into the receiver, begging the agents to hurry, claiming she feared for her life and the lives of her stepson and his wife currently in the house. She explicitly named me Richard Stanton, providing my exact home address, my personal network routing numbers, and the precise physical location of the secure flash drive sitting on my mahogany desk. She painted the perfect picture of a brave, desperate whistleblower risking everything. I sat alone in the dim glow of my rented apartment, listening to my own wife meticulously orchestrate my complete destruction. I did not feel sorrow or a sudden urge to panic. Instead, a profound, icy calm washed over every nerve in my body. The intricate web of lies had been fully spun, and now it was time to introduce the fire. I turned away from the video feed and focused entirely on my tactical server cluster. My hands moved across the keyboard with the steady precision of a man who had spent 30 years hunting apex predators. I initiated a secure, heavily encrypted tunnel directly into the classified back-end servers of the United States Treasury Department. I bypassed the standard reporting channels utilizing a deep access priority protocol assigned only to elite forensic auditors. I systematically bundled the undeniable proof of their crimes. I packaged the raw footage from the hidden study cameras capturing their clear faces, their verbal confessions, and their treasonous toast. I gathered the comprehensive data logs from the honeypot trap detailing every single keystroke Derek made while attempting to move the $8 million. I compiled the intercepted cellular metadata linking Victoria directly to Leo in the Bahamas, alongside the surveillance photographs Jonathan had forwarded. With one final decisive keystroke, I executed the master upload sequence. A green status bar appeared on my monitor, rapidly filling, as the massive data packet shot through the secure lines, landing directly on the desk of the Federal Director of Financial Crimes. The evidence was permanently logged into the federal database, completely out of my hands, and entirely immune to any physical destruction they might attempt. I watched the confirmation prompt flash across the screen, indicating the federal system had successfully received the critical threat package. My work here was officially finished. I powered down the tactical servers, wiping the temporary local drives clean with a localized magnetic sweep to ensure no digital residue remained in the apartment. I stood up from the uncomfortable folding chair and stretched my aching back. The joints in my knees popped in the quiet room, a sharp reminder of my 70 years of age. I walked over to the small closet where I had stored my travel bag. I moved with deliberate, unhurried grace. I took out a freshly pressed dark navy tailored suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a conservative silk tie. If I was going to be arrested in my own home tonight, I would meet the authorities looking exactly like the respected federal auditor I truly was, not a broken, defeated old man caught in his pajamas. I dressed carefully, adjusting my cuffs and ensuring my tie was perfectly straight. I strapped my classic silver watch to my wrist, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the heavy metal band against my skin. I packed my remaining personal items into my leather overnight bag, leaving the barren apartment exactly as empty and anonymous as I had found it. I stepped out into the cool, damp night air. The streets were deserted, cloaked in the quiet stillness that descends upon the suburbs in the deepest hours of the morning. I unlocked my modest sedan and slid behind the steering wheel. The drive back to my sprawling estate in McLean, Virginia took exactly 7 minutes. It was the most peaceful drive of my entire life. The streetlights passed overhead in a rhythmic sequence, casting long shadows across the dashboard. I felt absolutely no fear regarding the impending raid. I knew the aggressive tactical teams were already gearing up, slipping on their heavy bulletproof vests, acting on the frantic fabricated tip my wife had provided. They believed they were coming to apprehend a sophisticated money launderer. They were completely unaware that they were stepping directly into a carefully constructed theater where I had already written the final act. I pulled into my quiet neighborhood, keeping my headlights off to avoid alerting Victoria or Derek to my early return. I bypassed the main driveway, parking silently on the dark street 2 houses down. I grabbed my leather bag and walked through the damp grass, slipping through the side gate and entering my dark home through the secure utility door in the garage. The house was completely silent. I moved quietly through the shadows, making my way into the grand living room. The moonlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the expensive imported furniture Victoria had meticulously chosen to project our wealthy lifestyle. I walked over to the heavy crystal decanter sitting on the side table. I poured myself a modest measure of expensive aged bourbon, the amber liquid glowing faintly in the dim light. I walked over to my favorite high-backed leather armchair, positioned perfectly facing the front bay windows, and sat down. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the smooth bourbon, letting the familiar warmth bloom in my chest. I crossed my legs, rested my hands on the armrests, and simply waited in the suffocating silence. I thought about the 30 years I had dedicated to my country, the immense sacrifices I had made to provide for my treacherous family, and the profound, beautiful irony of what was about to happen. They thought they had buried me in a web of undeniable digital evidence. They thought their alliance with a deported cartel boss made them untouchable. They were about to discover exactly what happens when you attempt to corner a man who spent his entire career building cages for wolves. Red and blue police lights suddenly flashed through the living room window, and the heavy front door exploded violently inward. The heavy front door exploded violently inward, and the timeline of this nightmare slammed forward, catching up to the exact moment I found myself sitting across from Detective Harris in that sickly pale green interrogation room. The harsh fluorescent light hummed above us, casting long, sharp shadows across the metal table where my phone lay flat, streaming the undeniable truth. The smug, cynical judgment that had previously defined the detective's entire demeanor had completely evaporated. He sat frozen in his cheap metal folding chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my device. I had just walked him through the entire digital architecture of my meticulously constructed honeypot. He watched the cloned video feed of my wife and my son celebrating my impending doom. He saw the intercepted messages from a deported cartel boss. He witnessed the exact moment Victoria placed the anonymous call to the federal tip line, using the local police department as her personal, weaponized pawn. The silence in the small room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, shallow breathing of the veteran detective. Harris slowly raised his hands and rubbed his face as if trying to physically wipe away the sheer magnitude of the corruption he had just witnessed. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were burning with a fierce, humiliated rage. He realized instantly that his entire precinct had been played for absolute fools. They had been manipulated into acting as the blunt instrument of an organized crime syndicate, sent to arrest an innocent, decorated former federal auditor, while the real criminals drank vintage champagne in the comfort of my home. The vein in his neck pulsed visibly. He reached down to the heavy black utility belt at his waist and unclipped his police radio, his thumb hovering aggressively over the primary dispatch button. He looked at me, his jaw set in a tight, furious line. "I am calling the tactical response team right now." Harris growled, his voice vibrating with barely contained anger. "I am sending a fully armed SWAT unit back to your estate in McLean. We are going to kick down your front door a second time tonight, drag your treacherous wife out onto the driveway in handcuffs, and throw your son into the deepest holding cell this precinct has to offer. They are not going to get away with using my officers to facilitate a massive offshore money laundering operation." I did not hesitate. I slammed my open palm down flat against the cold metal interrogation table. The sudden violent noise cracked through the sterile room like a gunshot, echoing sharply off the concrete walls. The two uniformed officers guarding the door jumped in surprise, their hands instinctively dropping toward their weapons. Harris flinched, his thumb freezing just above the radio transmission button. "Stop!" I commanded, my voice projecting the absolute, unwavering authority of a man who had commanded federal task forces for 3 decades. "Do not arrest them yet. Put the radio down, detective." Harris stared at me in complete disbelief. His hand slowly lowered to the table, but he did not release his grip on the radio. "Are you out of your mind, Mr. Stanton?" he demanded, his voice rising in volume. "Your family is actively transferring $8 million to a known deported international criminal as we speak. They have just orchestrated a massive federal frame job against you. We have them dead to rights on tape. If we hit the house right now, we catch them with the digital hardware still completely active. We can end this entire nightmare tonight. If you send your tactical team into my house tonight, you will completely ruin 3 months of meticulous federal planning." I replied, my tone instantly dropping to a dangerously quiet, icy whisper. "Arresting Victoria and Derek right now is the absolute worst tactical maneuver we could possibly execute. If your local officers kick down that door and slap handcuffs on their wrists. The district attorney can only charge them with attempted wire fraud and local conspiracy. They will hire high-priced defense attorneys, drag the proceedings out through endless appeals, and likely serve less than 5 years in a minimum security white-collar facility. I do not want them to merely receive a mild slap on the wrist. I want to destroy them completely. I want them to feel the absolute crushing weight of the federal government dismantling their entire lives. Harris leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to process my cold, calculated logic. But the money, he argued, gesturing frantically toward my phone screen. If we do not stop them immediately, the $8 million will successfully clear the final offshore gateway. You will lose your entire life savings. I shook my head slowly, folding my hands together on the metal table. You are not thinking like a federal auditor detective. You are thinking like a local cop reacting to a standard robbery. I need you to understand the incredibly complex mechanics of federal asset forfeiture law. If you arrest them now, the transaction is officially interrupted mid-transfer. Because the funds were moving through a simulated honeypot, and because multiple international jurisdictions are suddenly involved, that $8 million will immediately enter a state of permanent legal limbo. It will be frozen by the international banking courts. It could take me a decade of grueling corporate litigation to prove the funds were stolen and successfully repatriate my own money back to the United States. Furthermore, if Leo senses any local police interference, he will instantly burn his servers in the Bahamas and vanish into the shadows before the FBI can establish a concrete jurisdictional claim. We cannot alert him. I leaned closer to Harris, maintaining intense, unbroken eye contact. The $8 million must officially land in the Cayman Islands account. It must register as a fully completed, successful transaction on Leo's private dashboard. The exact moment he attempts to move that capital into his secondary wash accounts, my silent quarantine protocol will instantly engage. The funds will be legally trapped in a secure federal escrow vault under the Patriot Act. By allowing them to complete the crime, we elevate the charges from simple attempted fraud to executing a massive act of international financial terrorism. Victoria and Derek will not just face local prosecutors. They will face the unyielding wrath of the United States Treasury Department. They will be looking at decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of parole. We have to let the trap close perfectly. We have to let them believe they have won. Harris stared at me, the profound realization of my strategy finally sinking in. He slowly set the radio down on the table, a look of grim respect replacing his previous anger. "You are a terrifying man to cross, Mr. Stanton," he whispered softly. Before I could respond, the heavy steel door of the interrogation room suddenly clicked and swung violently open. The two uniformed officers stepped aside immediately. Standing in the doorway, breathing heavily, as if he had just sprinted up 3 flights of stairs, was my former attorney, Jonathan Bradley. He was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, clutching a sleek silver iPad tightly in his right hand. His usually composed, incredibly stoic face was pale and slick with a thin layer of nervous sweat. He looked directly at me, completely ignoring the detective sitting across the table. "Rick," Jonathan said, his voice cracking with an unprecedented raw urgency that immediately set every nerve in my body on high alert. "You need to turn on the national news broadcast right now. Victoria did not just call the anonymous federal tip line. She just walked out the front door of your estate and went live on national television." Jonathan placed the sleek silver tablet directly in the center of the scratched metal table, his fingers tapping the screen to maximize the volume. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent light of the precinct interrogation room seemed to dim in comparison to the bright glow of the live, high-definition news feed. Detective Harris leaned forward, his heavy police radio completely forgotten, his eyes locked onto the digital display. I remained perfectly still in my metal folding chair, my breathing slow and measured as the morning news anchor appeared on the screen. The journalist wore a grim, deeply serious expression, speaking with the hushed, urgent cadence reserved for national tragedies and high-profile scandals. He announced that a massive federal investigation was currently unfolding in the affluent suburbs of McLean, Virginia, centering around a shocking international money laundering syndicate. The camera feed abruptly cut from the sterile news studio to a live, chaotic scene unfolding right on the sweeping front lawn of my own private estate. The early morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured grass. Red and blue police strobes still painted the brick facade of the house in frantic flashes of color. And standing right there in the center of the driveway, completely surrounded by a dense sea of aggressive reporters and shoving cameramen, was my treacherous wife. Victoria was delivering the absolute performance of a lifetime. She was dressed in a simple, remarkably unassuming gray sweater, clutching her arms tightly around her chest, as if she were desperately fighting off the cold. She wore absolutely no makeup. Her hair, usually styled to absolute perfection, was pulled back in a loose, messy knot. Her pale face was streaked with genuine heavy tears, her eyes wide and trembling with manufactured terror. She looked exactly like a completely devastated, heartbroken spouse whose entire world had just been violently shattered. Derek stood slightly behind her, playing the role of the protective, deeply traumatized son, holding his hand firmly on her shoulder. A dozen heavy microphones were thrust aggressively toward her face. Victoria took a ragged, shuddering breath and began to speak, her voice cracking flawlessly on cue. She told the ravenous press that she had accidentally stumbled upon a hidden, encrypted server in my private home study late last night. She wept openly, her shoulders shaking, claiming she had uncovered undeniable, horrific proof that her loving husband of 12 years was secretly operating a massive, illicit, international money laundering ring. She spun a terrifying, deeply compelling narrative, painting herself as a brave, terrified whistleblower who had no choice but to immediately call the federal authorities to stop my reign of financial terror. I watched her wipe a tear from her cheek with a trembling hand, her voice gaining a sudden righteous strength. She looked directly into the primary news camera, her eyes burning with a fabricated, highly passionate resolve. She publicly denounced me, labeling me a manipulative, cold-blooded monster who had used his prestigious federal background to steal millions of dollars from innocent, hard-working American citizens. Then she delivered the absolute masterstroke of her treacherous public relations campaign. She announced to the entire nation that she was currently filing an immediate emergency federal injunction through her legal counsel. She clearly stated her primary objective was to aggressively freeze the $8 million currently sitting in the offshore holding accounts and legally seize complete control of the funds. She swore to the breathless reporters that she would not rest until every single stolen dollar was successfully recovered and rightfully returned to the victims I had allegedly defrauded. The media absolutely devoured her story. The news anchor reappeared on the screen, solemnly confirming that I was currently a highly dangerous fugitive from federal justice, a white-collar predator who had finally been exposed by the extraordinary bravery of his own wife. The broadcast seamlessly transitioned to a panel of legal experts, all of whom immediately began analyzing the sheer magnitude of my supposed crimes and praising Victoria for her incredible civic duty. Detective Harris stared at the tablet in absolute shock. His mouth hung open, his police instincts overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the lie playing out on television. He slowly reached out and pressed the power button, plunging the metal table back into silence. He turned his head toward me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound disbelief and rising panic. He aggressively ran both of his hands through his thinning gray hair, leaning heavily against the back of his chair. "This is an absolute catastrophe," Mr. Stanton Harris muttered, his voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. "She is controlling the public narrative. By tomorrow morning, every federal agency will be hunting you down, and every news network will be painting you as a financial terrorist. She has successfully martyred herself while handing the authorities your head on a silver platter." He leaned across the table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the metal edge. "How do you intend to counter a public relations disaster of this magnitude? She claimed the moral high ground and destroyed your reputation in less than 3 minutes of airtime." I did not break my calm, calculating posture. I reached out, picked up the incredibly stale, lukewarm cup of precinct coffee sitting near my phone, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The bitter, acidic taste washed over my tongue, grounding my focus. I carefully set the styrofoam cup back down, folded my hands neatly on the table, and let a small, genuinely cold smile spread across my face. I looked directly into the detective's panicked eyes. "You are entirely missing the absolute beauty of her catastrophic mistake, Detective," I replied smoothly. "She did not just ruin my public reputation. By going on national television and officially filing a federal injunction to seize control of that specific offshore holding account, she just legally claimed direct ownership of a highly monitored, fully sanctioned international criminal asset. She thought she was building an impenetrable shield of public sympathy to safely extract the $8 million. But she just voluntarily tied her own name, her own signature, and her own legal representation directly to Leo's illegal cartel network." I leaned slightly forward, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "She just handed us her own death warrant on live television, completely wrapped in a beautiful, legally binding federal bow." Just as the profound weight of my strategic realization settled over the quiet interrogation room, the suffocating silence was abruptly broken. A sharp, aggressive vibration erupted from the pocket of Jonathan's tailored charcoal suit. My attorney pulled out his secure mobile device, scanning the bright notification illuminating the dark screen. The color instantly drained from his composed face, his rigid posture stiffening into absolute shock. He slowly looked up from his phone, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying, unprecedented intensity. "Rick," Jonathan whispered, his voice hollow and tight with sudden dread. "The federal court issued a priority alert. The presiding judge, moved by Victoria's tears and her fabricated plea for justice, has approved her emergency injunction. She is now legally in complete control of the offshore holding account." Jonathan stood frozen in the doorway of the interrogation room. His tailored charcoal suit looked entirely out of place against the pale green cinderblock walls. He held the silver tablet with a grip so tight his knuckles were stark white. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum louder, filling the suffocating silence. He stared at me, waiting for the devastating reality of his announcement to shatter my composure. Victoria had outmaneuvered us. She had bypassed the local police raid, gone straight to the national media, wept her manufactured tears, and successfully convinced a federal judge to grant her immediate legal control over the $8 million currently sitting in the offshore holding account. Detective Harris let out a long, ragged exhale. The veteran police officer slowly sank back into his cheap metal folding chair. He stared at the scratched surface of the table, his shoulders slumping under the weight of an absolute catastrophic defeat. "She got the money," Harris whispered, his voice completely devoid of its former righteous fury. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a bitter resignation. "We lost Mr. Stanton. She played the entire system flawlessly. She used my precinct to stage a raid, used the press to build a protective shield of public sympathy, and now she has used a federal judge to hand her the keys to the vault. By the time the Treasury Department untangles this massive jurisdictional mess, she and her cartel boyfriend will have vanished into the wind." I looked at the detective and then at my panicked attorney. I did not sigh. I simply reached forward, picked up my styrofoam cup of lukewarm precinct coffee, and took another slow, deliberate sip. I placed the cup back onto the table with a soft thud. I slowly shook my head, letting a genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face. I reached into my leather overnight bag, pulled out my encrypted laptop, and opened the screen. "You are both looking at this situation through the narrow lens of a conventional robbery," I said smoothly, my voice projecting a calm, unyielding authority. "You see a woman who just legally seized a vault full of cash. I see a woman who just voluntarily walked into a maximum security federal prison and handed the warden the key to her own cell." Jonathan stepped further into the room, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Rick, the judge, just signed the injunction," he argued, gesturing toward his tablet. "The order is fully executed. She is the legally recognized owner of the Cayman Islands holding account as of exactly 4 minutes ago." I turned my laptop toward them, the screen illuminating the dim room with the stark white text of a highly classified federal statute. "Look closely at the specific legal mechanics of what she just accomplished," I instructed them. "Victoria went on national television and publicly claimed she was filing an emergency injunction to seize the funds and return them to the victims. To do that, she had to submit a sworn, legally binding affidavit to a federal judge. She had to officially register her name, her personal social security number, and the operational details of her newly formed charitable foundation as the primary receiving entities. Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the complex legal jargon scrolling across my monitor. "I still do not understand how this helps us," the detective admitted. "She secured the money. She secured absolute legal liability for a terrorist asset," I corrected him sharply. "Victoria believes that account simply holds $8 million of my stolen wealth. But she is entirely unaware of the silent quarantine protocol Jonathan and I initiated earlier tonight. When we locked that account, we did not just freeze the funds. We explicitly flagged the Cayman Islands routing numbers within the internal servers of the Internal Revenue Service and the Treasury Department. We permanently classified that specific offshore holding company as a Level 1 federal threat, directly linking it to Leo and his known international money laundering syndicate." I watched the realization slowly begin to dawn on Jonathan's face. His mouth parted slightly, as the sheer, terrifying brilliance of the trap finally became apparent. "By filing that federal injunction," I continued, my voice steady and cold, "Victoria just went on the official legal record claiming direct personal ownership of an active, heavily monitored cartel account. She swore under penalty of perjury that she is the rightful administrator of those funds. Furthermore, the charitable foundation she used to file the injunction was co-signed by my son Derek. He is listed as the primary financial director on all the fabricated tax exemption forms they created on my computer tonight." Harris let out a sharp gasp, the cynical resignation completely vanishing from his face, replaced by an expression of profound shock. "They did not just steal your money," the detective whispered, staring at me as if he were looking at a ghost. "No, they did not," I confirmed, closing the laptop with a definitive, satisfying snap. "They just legally tied their own names to a known, sanctioned terrorist organization. They voluntarily walked into a federal court and signed legally binding documents claiming ownership of deeply illegal funds. The specific IRS tripwire I established earlier tonight automatically registers any unauthorized attempt to access that account as an act of international financial terrorism. By seizing control of the funds, Victoria and Derek just committed federal treason and grand larceny on paper. They have effectively bypassed the need for a lengthy investigation or a complex trial. They provided the federal prosecutors with an ironclad signed confession. The magnitude of their catastrophic miscalculation hung heavily in the quiet interrogation room. Victoria thought she was securing her glamorous future in the Bahamas with her dangerous lover. Instead, she had meticulously built an inescapable cage for herself and my treacherous son. The federal government would not even need to hunt them down. The authorities would simply wait for them to attempt a single withdrawal, and the entire weight of the United States justice system would crash down upon them with absolute merciless finality. Jonathan slowly lowered his tablet, letting out a breathless chuckle that sounded almost hysterical. "Rick," he said, shaking his head in absolute awe, "that is the most brutal, flawless execution of asset forfeiture law I have ever witnessed. You completely obliterated them without even lifting a single finger." The silence was suddenly shattered by a loud, insistent buzzing. The sharp vibration echoed against the metal table. We looked down simultaneously. My cell phone was actively ringing next to my coffee cup. I stared at the glowing caller identification display, feeling an icy thrill shoot down my spine. The name flashing on the screen was Derek. My son, the arrogant fool who conspired to put me in a federal prison, was calling me in the middle of his own catastrophe. He believed I was currently sitting in a jail cell, completely ruined and defeated. Detective Harris looked at the phone with intense curiosity. I reached out, calmly dragged my finger across the smooth glass to answer the call, deliberately pressed the speakerphone button, and set the device back down on the table. The sharp mechanical ringing of my cellular phone ceased the exact fraction of a second my finger tapped the smooth glass of the digital screen. I activated the external speaker function, placed the device gently down on the center of the scratched metal interrogation table, and leaned back into my uncomfortable folding chair. For a brief moment, the only sound in the suffocatingly small room was the heavy rhythmic breathing of Detective Harris and the faint nervous hum of Jonathan shifting his weight near the heavy steel door. Then a voice burst through the tiny digital speaker, instantly shattering the tense silence. It was Derek. My son sounded completely frantic, his words rushing out in a breathless, chaotic flood that was expertly designed to convey absolute terror and profound filial devotion. It was a spectacular, almost flawless performance of a deeply traumatized child realizing his father was in grave danger. If I had not spent the entire evening watching him actively orchestrate my absolute destruction on hidden cameras, I might have actually believed the raw panic bleeding through the telephone line. Dad. Oh my God, Dad, please tell me you are actually there. Please tell me you can hear my voice right now. Derek shouted through the speaker, panting heavily as if he were physically running a marathon while gripping the steering wheel of his expensive sports car. I just saw the national news broadcast playing on the televisions down at the Harbor Club. The entire country is watching this absolute nightmare unfold live on the morning networks. I saw Victoria standing in the driveway with the federal agents. I saw the flashing police lights illuminating the front lawn of the estate. I completely panicked when I realized you were already gone. I have been calling your personal number for the past 20 minutes, trying to figure out where the authorities took you. Listen to me very carefully, Dad. You have absolutely nothing to worry about. I am handling everything on this end. I immediately contacted the most aggressive, high-profile defense attorneys in the entire state of Virginia. They are already assembling a crisis management team to fight these ridiculous fabricated charges. I am currently speeding down the interstate right now, pushing this car as fast as the engine will possibly allow. I am driving directly to the main police precinct to bail you out personally. I am not going to let you sit in some filthy concrete holding cell for crimes you obviously did not commit. We are going to beat this together as a family. Just hold on for a few more minutes. The sheer audacity of his lies hung thickly in the stale air of the interrogation room. Detective Harris stared at the small black rectangle sitting on the metal table, his jaw clenched so tightly, the muscles in his cheeks twitched. He was watching a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation unfold in real time. Jonathan remained completely still by the door, his eyes wide, absorbing the absolute depravity of my own flesh and blood. I took a slow, deep breath, preparing to deliver my own calculated performance. I needed to feed his monumental ego to make him believe his trap was working perfectly, and to draw him blindly into the center of my own snare. Derek, thank God you called me. I replied intentionally, forcing my voice to tremble and crack with the fragile, pathetic vulnerability of a broken, thoroughly defeated old man. I pitched my tone perfectly, sounding incredibly confused, deeply frightened, and completely overwhelmed by the catastrophic events of the evening. I slumped my shoulders forward physically, embodying the utter despair I was projecting through the phone line. I do not understand what is happening to me tonight, Derek. The local police officers brought me down to this dark precinct hours ago. The federal agents are currently tearing apart my private study. They are aggressively interrogating me, demanding answers about massive international bank transfers and illicit offshore accounts. They are telling me that I stole millions of dollars. They are saying I am going to spend the rest of my life locked away in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I did not do any of this, son. You have to believe me. Someone has terribly framed me. I do not know how to fight this massive government machine. I am so unbelievably scared. Through the speaker, I heard Derek let out a long, heavy exhale. It was the sound of a predator finally sensing the fatal weakness of its cornered prey. He had completely swallowed the bait. He genuinely believed I was sitting in this room crying and trembling, utterly paralyzed by the sheer terror of my impending federal indictment. The frantic high-energy panic immediately vanished from his voice, replaced by a low, urgent, and incredibly conspiratorial whisper. He was leaning in for the final devastating kill. Listen to me right now, Dad. You need to remain absolutely silent. Do not speak to any of the detectives. Do not answer a single question the federal agents ask you. They are actively building a massive case against you, and they will twist every single syllable you say to guarantee a conviction. The absolute most important thing we need to do right this very second is secure your personal legacy. We cannot let the federal government swoop in and confiscate your entire life savings while you are trapped behind bars fighting these horrific fabricated allegations. I need you to listen to me very carefully, Dad. My defense attorneys have already drafted an emergency comprehensive power of attorney document. I am bringing it directly to the precinct with me right now. The absolute second I walk through those front doors, I need you to sign complete legal control of your remaining domestic assets directly over to my name. If you sign the power of attorney, I can immediately transfer all of your clean capital into secure, untraceable corporate trusts before the Treasury Department finalizes their total asset freeze. I will safeguard every single penny of your wealth. I will hide it so deeply the federal auditors will never be able to touch it. But we have to move with absolute blinding speed. The government is moving incredibly fast, and the judicial window to protect your estate is closing rapidly. Just keep your mouth firmly shut, wait for me to arrive and sign the documents the moment I put them on the table. Do not worry about anything else tonight. I am coming to save you. I appreciate that, son, I whispered softly into the receiver, letting my voice shake one final time. Please hurry. The digital connection went completely dead with a sharp, abrupt click. I sat forward in the quiet interrogation room, letting the profound, heavy silence wash over the sterile space once more. I slowly reached out, picked up my device, and slid it back into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I looked up and met Detective Harris's stunned gaze. My fragile, frightened demeanor instantly vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, unbreakable resolve. Get your heavy handcuffs ready, Detective, I commanded softly. The absolute savior is arriving in exactly 5 minutes. Detective Harris did not utter a single syllable. He simply nodded, his eyes locked onto mine with a profound, newfound reverence. He slowly stood up from the scratched metal table, adjusting his heavy utility belt with a crisp, professional efficiency that completely erased his previous posture of defeat. We walked out of the claustrophobic interrogation room together, leaving the stale air and the harsh fluorescent lights behind. I draped my tailored navy suit jacket casually over my right shoulder, rolling up the crisp white sleeves of my dress shirt. I felt an incredible, weightless freedom settling deep into my bones. For the past 3 hours, I had been playing the role of a terrified, cornered animal. Now the absolute predator was stepping out of the shadows. We moved silently down the narrow, scuffed hallway toward the main precinct lobby. The heavy double doors separating the holding cells from the public intake area hummed with a low electronic buzz. Harris swiped his keycard, and we stepped into the expansive, brightly lit room. The lobby was relatively quiet for an early Friday morning, occupied only by a few tired officers processing overnight paperwork and a lone janitor pushing a mop bucket across the dull linoleum floor. I leaned comfortably against the cold concrete wall near the secure access doors, folding my arms across my chest, and waited for the grand theatrical performance I knew was about to begin. Exactly 4 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the main precinct entrance were violently pushed open. Derek strode into the police station with the overwhelming, unearned arrogance of a man who believed he practically owned the entire world. He was wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue Italian suit that probably cost more than most of the officers in the room earned in a month. His hair was perfectly styled, slicked back to project absolute corporate authority. He did not look like a panicked, grieving son desperately trying to save his father from a catastrophic misunderstanding. He looked exactly like a victorious corporate raider arriving to finalize a hostile takeover. Flanking him on either side were 2 incredibly imposing, severely dressed defense attorneys. They carried thick leather briefcases and wore expressions of bored, aggressive superiority. Derek marched directly toward the main intake desk, completely ignoring the tired desk sergeant who was currently holding up a hand to pause him. Derek slammed his open palm down onto the high wooden counter, demanding immediate, unquestioned attention. He projected his voice across the entire lobby, ensuring every single person in the room could hear his magnificent display of manufactured outrage. He declared that he was the son of Richard Stanton, the man they had wrongfully and illegally arrested earlier this morning. He demanded to see the commanding officer, immediately threatening massive career-ending lawsuits if his father was not instantly released into his custody. He waved his hand toward the two expensive lawyers standing rigidly beside him, loudly proclaiming that they possessed emergency federal injunctions and a comprehensive power of attorney that explicitly superseded any local jurisdictional authority. I stood in the shadows near the secure access doors, watching my son perform his flawless routine. He was playing the role of the outraged protective heir to absolute perfection. He was laying the groundwork to legally assume total control of my entire estate, using his expensive legal team to bulldoze through the local police bureaucracy before the federal government could properly secure my assets. It was a brilliant, incredibly aggressive strategy, and if he had actually been dealing with a senile, terrified old man, it would have worked flawlessly. I pushed myself off the cold concrete wall and took a slow, deliberate step forward into the harsh overhead lighting of the main lobby. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my leather dress shoes, echoing across the linoleum floor, instantly drew the attention of the two defense attorneys. They turned their heads simultaneously, their aggressive postures faltering for a fraction of a second. Derek noticed their sudden shift in focus and slowly turned around. The magnificent, arrogant smile that had been firmly plastered across his face completely evaporated the exact second his eyes locked onto mine. He froze perfectly still, his mouth hanging slightly open, his mind violently struggling to process the impossible image standing directly in front of him. I was not wearing an orange prison jumpsuit. I was not confined to a dark, miserable holding cell. I was not trembling with fear or begging for his miraculous salvation. I was standing freely in the center of the precinct, my suit jacket slung casually over my shoulder, looking entirely relaxed and completely in command of the entire building. "Dad." Derek stammered, his voice suddenly shrinking into a high, weak register that betrayed his absolute internal panic. The confident corporate raider instantly vanished, replaced by a terrified little boy caught in a massive lie. "Why are you out here? Why aren't you in a cell? They told me you were being processed for massive federal fraud." The two expensive defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances, as they quickly realized the situation was completely spiraling out of their control. I did not break my steady, unyielding eye contact with my son. I walked slowly across the precinct lobby, my footsteps echoing loudly in the deafening silence. I walked right past the two highly paid lawyers, completely ignoring their presence, and stopped merely inches away from Derek. I could see the tiny beads of cold sweat forming along his perfectly styled hairline. I could see the frantic, desperate calculation burning behind his eyes as his entire reality began to collapse. I leaned in very close, closing the distance until I was speaking directly into his right ear. I dropped my voice to a dangerous, icy whisper, ensuring only he could hear the absolute finality of his profound failure. "Did you really think a veteran Treasury auditor would not notice a simple 2mm shift on a physical USB drive sitting on his own desk, Derek?" The sheer terror that violently washed over his pale face was the single most satisfying reward I had ever received in my entire long life. Before Derek could even attempt to formulate a coherent response, before his highly paid legal team could demand an explanation or mount any kind of defense, the heavy double-glass doors of the main precinct entrance burst violently open for a second time. The deafening sound of heavy tactical boots pounding against the hard linoleum floor completely overwhelmed the quiet lobby. 6 heavily armed federal agents, all wearing dark blue windbreakers with the bright yellow letters representing the Federal Bureau of Investigation, stamped aggressively across their backs, swarmed into the room with absolute military precision. They moved with terrifying speed, immediately securing the perimeter and completely bypassing the stunned local desk sergeant. The lead federal agent, a tall, incredibly imposing man with a grim, uncompromising expression, marched directly into the center of the lobby. He completely ignored me. He completely ignored the two terrified defense attorneys. He raised his right hand, pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at the chest of my trembling, severely panicked son, and effectively signaled the absolute end of his miserable existence. The lead agent did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He lunged forward with terrifying speed, grabbing the lapels of Derek's expensive Italian suit in his massive fists. Before my son could even process the violent shift in reality, the agent spun him around with brutal, practiced efficiency and slammed him face first against the heavy wooden surface of the main intake desk. The sickening thud of the impact echoed through the cavernous lobby, silencing every single person in the room. The tired desk sergeant instantly stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of complete surrender to federal jurisdiction. Derek let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pain as the agent forcefully pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic clatter of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists sounded like the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. Derek Stanton, the lead agent, barked, his deep voice booming with absolute terrifying authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, international criminal conspiracy, and massive corporate money laundering. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it right now before you dig your grave any deeper." The sheer panic that erupted from my son was entirely pathetic. He began to thrash weakly against the solid wood of the counter, his expensive shoes slipping uselessly against the polished linoleum floor. He twisted his neck, his eyes wide and leaking fresh, terrified tears. He looked frantically toward the two imposing defense attorneys he had paraded into the precinct just moments ago. "Do something!" Derek screamed, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "I am paying you $500 an hour. Show them the power of attorney. Tell them to let me go. This is a massive mistake. You have to stop them right now. I am not supposed to be in handcuffs." The two lawyers did not move a single muscle to assist him. The older of the two men, a sharp, cynical attorney with graying temples, cautiously stepped forward and raised his hands in a placating gesture toward the federal tactical team. He politely requested to see the official arrest warrant before his client was processed. A secondary FBI agent pulled a thick, heavily stamped document from his tactical vest and shoved it forcefully into the lawyer's chest. I watched the attorney's eyes scan the complex legal text. I watched the exact moment his professional confidence completely evaporated. The federal warrant specifically detailed charges of international terrorism financing, citing direct, undeniable ties to a sanctioned cartel holding account in the Cayman Islands. The lawyer blanched, his face draining of all color. He looked at the federal agent, then looked down at the screaming, thrashing boy pinned against the desk. He slowly folded the warrant, handed it back to the agent, and took 3 very deliberate steps backward, physically distancing himself from my son. "We do not handle federal terrorism charges," the lawyer stated coldly, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. "We are officially withdrawing our representation of Mr. Stanton, effective immediately. You are completely on your own, Derek. We cannot help you fight the United States Treasury Department." Derek let out a guttural, desperate sob as his highly paid legal shield vanished into the thin air. He wrenched his head around, his terrified eyes locking onto mine. He looked at me with the desperate, pleading gaze of a lost child, entirely forgetting that just 10 minutes ago he was actively plotting to lock me away in a federal penitentiary and steal my entire life savings. "Dad," Derek cried out, the tears streaming freely down his bruised cheeks. "Dad, you have to help me. You know I did not do this. You know I am innocent. Please tell them to stop. Tell them I am your son. You cannot let them do this to me." I did not flinch. I did not move. I simply stood there, my suit jacket draped casually over my shoulder, looking down at him with an expression as cold and unforgiving as solid ice. I felt absolutely no pity, no paternal instinct to protect him from the fire he had intentionally ignited. He had made his choices in the dark, and now he was burning in the blinding light of federal justice. I slowly walked over to the desk, standing directly beside the federal agent, who was currently holding my son down. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved my cellular phone. I tapped the screen, unlocking the device, and opened the highly classified federal tracking application I had synced with the Treasury Department servers. I held the bright, glowing screen down directly in front of Derek's tear-streaked face, forcing him to look at the undeniable digital proof of his own profound stupidity. "Take a very close look at the screen, Derek," I whispered, my voice slicing through his hysterical sobbing with surgical precision. "Do you recognize that specific routing number? It belongs to the secure Cayman Islands holding account you thought you successfully wired $8 million into tonight. You thought you were so incredibly brilliant. You thought you and your treacherous wife were playing a masterful game of financial chess, but you are looking at a live, active tracking feed from the Internal Revenue Service. That account was a trap. It was a digital honeypot designed to catch a much larger predator, and you walked right into the center of the cage like a blind rat." I slowly scrolled down the digital document displayed on my phone, highlighting a specific glaring section of text for him to read. When Victoria went on national television and filed that emergency federal injunction, she legally seized ownership of these illicit funds. I explained, my words dropping like heavy stones upon his shattered reality. But she needed a legitimate domestic financial entity to process the paperwork. She used your newly formed charity. She dragged your forged digital signature onto the founding documents. Do you understand what that means, Derek? The federal government just officially seized the entire offshore account, and this live forfeiture document currently lists Victoria Stanton and Derek Stanton as the primary legally binding administrators of a sanctioned terrorist asset. You did not steal my money. You merely signed a legal confession to grand larceny and international racketeering. Your beautiful wife just destroyed your entire life to save her own skin, and she did it using your own immense greed against you. The realization of his absolute inescapable doom finally washed over him. The frantic, struggling energy completely left his body. Derek went entirely limp against the desk. The federal agent supported his dead weight, pulling him upright and shoving him roughly toward the secure holding area. Derek dropped heavily onto his knees, right in the middle of the precinct floor, his suit wrinkling as he collapsed. He buried his face in his manacled hands, sobbing uncontrollably. He had absolutely nothing left. I looked down at the pathetic shell of the boy I once loved. I turned my back on him. "Keep him completely isolated, detective. Now let us go pay a visit to my grieving wife." The drive from the precinct back to McLean was a study in quiet anticipation. Detective Harris sat beside me in the unmarked police vehicle, gripping the steering wheel as the morning sun climbed into the sky. I sat in the passenger seat, relaxed, watching familiar streets roll past. The chaotic media circus that occupied my front lawn hours earlier had dispersed, leaving behind only trampled grass and the hollow echo of my wife's tearful performance. She had spun her web of lies and manipulated a federal judge into handing her control over my supposed fortune. She thought the war was won. She thought it was over. Inside my private estate, Victoria was celebrating the zenith of her treacherous campaign. Through the surveillance feeds I still monitored on my mobile device, I perfectly envisioned the scene unfolding in the formal living room. She sat gracefully on the expensive Italian leather sofa, her fabricated tears entirely replaced by a radiant, triumphant glow. Her close friend Monica lounged in the matching armchair. They were clinking crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne, toasting to their flawless victory. The morning news broadcasts played quietly on the television, the legal pundits endlessly praising Victoria for her civic bravery. Resting on the glass coffee table between them, illuminated by the sunlight streaming through the windows, was the freshly signed federal injunction. It was her golden ticket to absolute freedom, her legal shield against financial inquiries, and the exact instrument of her impending demise. They laughed, a sharp sound echoing through the empty halls of the mansion. Victoria took a delicate sip of champagne, her eyes reflecting the pure greed that had driven her to destroy our marriage. She believed the $8 million was permanently hers. She believed Derek was executing the final phase of their hostilité by forcing me to sign away my domestic wealth. She had absolutely no idea her son was sitting on the cold floor of a federal holding cell, weeping into his manacled hands, broken, and facing decades in prison. She was entirely oblivious to the armored tactical vehicles silently rolling to a stop at the edge of our sprawling driveway. The federal tactical team moved with terrifying efficiency. There were no sirens to announce their arrival. They poured out of the dark vehicles a dozen heavily armed agents wearing thick gear and carrying breaching equipment. They moved swiftly across the manicured lawn, stacking up against the custom mahogany front doors of the estate. Detective Harris pulled our unmarked car to a quiet stop near the front gates, leaving the engine idling smoothly. I unbuckled my seatbelt, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and stood comfortably by the edge of the driveway, ready to witness the spectacular conclusion of Victoria's grand illusion. Inside the living room, Monica raised her crystal flute for another celebratory toast. She never finished her sentence. The deafening explosion of the front doors being violently battered off their heavy iron hinges shook the foundation of the house. The massive wooden panels splintered inward, with a horrific crack raining sharp shards of wood and shattered glass across the grand foyer. Victoria screamed a genuine sound of pure terror, dropping her champagne flute onto the hardwood floor, where it shattered into glittering pieces. Heavy tactical boots pounded against the polished floors as federal agents swarmed into the living room from every conceivable angle, their weapons raised, their voices booming with uncompromising authority. "Federal agents, get your hands where we can see them right now." The commanding shouts echoed through the house, completely drowning out the television broadcast. Monica instantly dropped to her knees, raising her trembling hands high above her head, her face drained of color. But Victoria, blinded by her incredible arrogance and absolute belief in her newly acquired legal immunity, refused to surrender. She stood up abruptly from the leather sofa, her face twisting into a mask of indignant rage. She snatched the freshly signed court documents from the glass coffee table, waving them aggressively toward the advancing tactical team. "You cannot be in my house!" Victoria screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and commanding. "You have absolutely no jurisdiction here. I am the victim. I am the one who called the authorities. You are making a massive mistake. I have a legally binding court order protecting my assets. Do you hear me? I have a federal injunction signed by a judge just hours ago. You cannot touch me. You cannot touch anything in this house." The lead FBI agent, a tall woman with a gaze as hard as forged steel, stepped calmly forward. She did not raise her weapon. She simply reached out with a gloved hand and smoothly snatched the crumpled legal documents directly from Victoria's frantic grasp. The agent glanced down at the papers, her eyes scanning the official judicial seal and Victoria's bold signature at the bottom of the page. A chilling smile spread across the federal agent's face. "Thank you, ma'am," the agent replied, her voice projecting a calm satisfaction that completely silenced Victoria's hysterical screaming. "We were concerned we might have to spend months trying to prove you had direct knowledge of the illicit funds. But this signed document claiming legal ownership of a sanctioned cartel-linked offshore account is exactly the written confession we needed." Victoria froze. The color vanished from her face, leaving her skin a translucent white. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her mind struggling to process the devastating reality of the trap she had voluntarily walked into. She had not seized my money. She had formally claimed ownership of dirty cartel funds on the permanent federal record. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around her wrists, with a sharp metallic click biting into her delicate skin. The agents spun her around, roughly ignoring her desperate weeping, and began marching her out of the grand living room she had claimed as her kingdom. They dragged her forcefully through the shattered remains of the front entryway, and out into the bright morning sunlight. Victoria stumbled down the wide stone steps, her legs weak and trembling, her head hanging in total humiliation. She was crying hysterically now, begging the stoic agents to listen to her, pleading for them to call her lawyers. They completely ignored her frantic sobbing. The lead agent shoved her aggressively toward the back of a waiting police cruiser, pulling open the heavy door to force her inside. Just before the agent pushed her head down to clear the roofline, Victoria turned her tear-streaked face toward the driveway. She was looking for an escape, for any shred of hope. Instead, she found me. I was standing still in the center of the driveway, in the precise spot where she had stood 12 hours earlier while delivering her performance to the national media. I was holding my phone up at chest level, the camera lens pointed directly at her ruined face. I watched the crushing realization wash over her as our eyes locked across the distance. I did not speak. I simply stood there recording every single second of her destruction, wearing a cold smirk that promised her absolute inescapable ruin. The drive back to the main precinct was swift, unburdened by the tension that had suffocated the early morning hours. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Detective Harris and the lead federal investigator in the dark, narrow corridor that connected the primary holding cells. Beyond the heavy cinder block walls, 3 separate interrogation rooms were currently occupied by the architects of my attempted destruction. Victoria, Derek, and Monica were isolated from one another, stripped of their expensive legal counsel, and left entirely alone with the crushing weight of their federal treason charges. I stood perfectly still before the large 2-way glass mirror, my arms folded loosely across my chest, watching the rapid, spectacular disintegration of their unholy alliance. The federal prosecutors did not even need to employ aggressive interrogation tactics. They simply walked into each room, placed the signed injunction documents on the metal tables, and outlined the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for international terrorism financing. The unified front they had so arrogantly paraded just hours ago evaporated like morning mist under a scorching sun. I shifted my gaze to the monitor displaying the live feed from Interrogation Room A. Derek was sitting in a metal folding chair, his expensive tailored suit hanging awkwardly on his trembling frame. He lasted less than 4 minutes. The exact second the federal agent mentioned a 20-year federal prison sentence, my son completely folded. He began weeping openly, aggressively, throwing Victoria directly under the proverbial bus. He frantically told the agents that Victoria was the absolute mastermind, that she had manipulated him, coerced him into forming the charity, and orchestrated the entire financial scheme. He claimed he was nothing more than an innocent pawn in his stepmother's treacherous game. I felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me, completely erasing any lingering trace of paternal affection I might have still harbored. He was just a pathetic coward fully willing to burn the woman he conspired with to save his own miserable skin. In Interrogation Room B, Monica was delivering an equally pathetic performance. The woman who had lounged on my Italian leather sofa drinking vintage champagne was now a frantic, shivering mess. She practically threw herself across the table, screaming that she had absolutely nothing to do with the cartel money. She loudly proclaimed that Derek was a weak, pathetic fool who had ruined everything, but she reserved her deepest venom for Victoria. She wildly blamed her best friend for dragging her into a massive federal conspiracy, offering to testify to every single detail of their private conversations in exchange for full immunity. The house of cards had now completely collapsed, and the desperate rats were violently turning on each other in the cold, empty dark. I turned my attention away from the monitors and focused on the window directly in front of me. Victoria was sitting alone in Interrogation Room C. She looked utterly exhausted, her posture slumped, her manufactured bravery completely stripped away by the terrifying reality of her situation. The lead federal agent looked at me and offered a slow, understanding nod. He reached out and opened the heavy steel door, stepping aside to safely allow me entry. The incredibly harsh fluorescent lights buzzed softly as I walked into the room. Victoria slowly raised her head, her red, swollen eyes locking onto mine. For a brief, fleeting moment, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear flashing across her pale face. But the instinct to manipulate was too deeply ingrained in her nature. She instantly shifted her demeanor, falling back on the only weapon she had left. She closed her eyes and began to softly weep. She pushed herself up from the chair, stumbling very slightly, and reached her trembling hands out toward me across the scratched metal table. "Richard, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with a desperate, practiced fragility. "Please, you have to help me. You have to tell them this is a terrible misunderstanding. I am your wife. We spent 12 long years together. We loved each other. I was just scared, Richard. I was confused and frightened, and I made a terrible mistake. Please, I am begging you, look into your heart and forgive me. I know you still love me. Do not let them lock me away in a dark cell for the rest of my life." She was actively delivering the absolute performance of a lifetime, flawlessly projecting the tragic image of a lost, deeply repentant spouse, desperately seeking the safe, protective embrace of her husband. I did not move a single muscle. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer her a single fraction of an inch of emotional ground. I stood perfectly straight, my expression as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. I slowly reached into the interior breast pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved a small, neatly bound stack of high-resolution photographs. I tossed them casually onto the metal table. The glossy images fanned out across the surface, brightly illuminated by the harsh overhead light. They were the surveillance photographs my own private investigator had captured. They clearly showed Victoria and Leo embracing in the dark corner of the exclusive upscale restaurant, kissing very passionately, their faces illuminated by the street lamps plotting my absolute ruin. Victoria stared down at the photographs, the color draining completely from her tear-streaked face. Her mouth opened, but the desperate, manipulative words died instantly in her throat. Her hands fell limply to her sides. "You thought you were playing a retired old fool," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and deadly. "But you forgot, Victoria. I spent 30 years hunting the smartest financial predators in the world. You were just a sloppy amateur." Those words shattered her grand illusion. Victoria physically collapsed, dropping heavily back into the metal folding chair. Her shoulders shook with hollow sobs as the inescapable reality of her destruction settled over her. She realized in that dark, sterile room that she had absolutely nothing left. She had no money, no powerful lover, no loyal friends, and absolutely no future outside of a federal penitentiary. I turned my back on her. I slowly walked out of the small interrogation room, leaving the heavy steel door open behind me. I then walked confidently through the bustling precinct lobby and pushed through the main glass doors, stepping out into the bright, warming light of the morning sun. I took a long, deep breath of the crisp, clean air, feeling the immense weight of the past 24 hours completely lift away from my tired shoulders. As I stood alone on the concrete front steps, enjoying the profound silence of my victory, a short, sharp vibration echoed from the pocket of my dark gray tailored suit. I reached down, pulled out my personal mobile phone, and looked at the glowing screen. It was a highly secure, encrypted notification sent directly from the Internal Revenue Service. The new digital text message was incredibly brief and absolutely beautiful to read right now. The federal quarantine had been officially lifted, the illicit offshore funds had been completely seized, and my $8 million had been officially cleared and successfully returned to my secure, personal accounts. 6 months have passed since that crisp morning on the precinct steps. The wheels of the federal justice system are notoriously slow, but when they finally turn, they grind with an absolute crushing certainty. I attended the highly publicized sentencing hearings in my finest tailored suits, sitting silently in the back row of the massive federal courtroom, watching the grand, inevitable conclusion of their treacherous ambitions play out before a packed gallery. Victoria and her dangerous lover, Leo, stood side by side before the imposing wooden bench. The glamorous, untouchable facade she had so meticulously maintained throughout our marriage was completely gone, entirely replaced by by the pale, trembling reality of a broken woman facing the absolute abyss. The presiding judge showed absolutely no mercy, handing them both maximum sentences of exactly 20 years in a high-security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole for international wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. They were led away in heavy steel chains, their luxurious lives entirely reduced to a cold, sterile concrete cell. The trial of Derek was equally pathetic and immensely satisfying to witness. Stripped of his expensive corporate armor and his arrogant illusions of grandeur, my treacherous son wept openly and begged for leniency as the heavy wooden gavel fell, cementing his mandatory 12-year federal sentence. He will spend his absolute prime years locked safely away, surrounded by the very criminals he foolishly thought he could outsmart and manipulate. As for Monica, her desperate, frantic attempts to secure legal immunity by testifying against her best friend failed spectacularly. She narrowly avoided a prison sentence, but the aggressive financial penalties and the exorbitant legal fees completely drained her domestic accounts. She filed for total bankruptcy just last week, watching helplessly as the federal government aggressively seized every single valuable asset she possessed to auction off. They had all gambled their lives on my total destruction, and they had all lost absolutely everything. Today, I am far away from the toxic, suffocating wealth of the Virginia suburbs. I sit quietly on the sweeping wooden porch of my newly purchased, highly secluded log cabin, nestled deep within the gorgeous Blue Ridge Mountains. The crisp, clean autumn air carries the fresh scent of pine needles and burning firewood. I take a slow, immensely satisfying drag from a premium imported cigar, letting the rich, aromatic smoke curl lazily into the bright afternoon sky. In my other hand, I hold a heavy crystal glass filled generously with a rare, perfectly aged bourbon. The golden liquid burns smoothly down my throat, serving as a warm, comforting, and highly satisfying reminder of my hard-fought, decisive victory. Spread neatly across the rustic wooden table resting directly in front of me are the final officially notarized legal documents delivered this morning by my attorney, Jonathan. I reach forward, unscrew the cap of my favorite fountain pen, and sign my name along the dotted lines with a steady, deliberate, and unwavering hand. With those final, precise strokes of dark ink, I am permanently transferring the entirely recovered $8 million into a genuine, irrevocable trust fund designed exclusively for the benefit of vulnerable foster children. The massive account is now fully managed by a strict, independent third-party financial firm, permanently ensuring that not a single penny can ever be touched by familial greed or manipulation. The immense wealth that was once meant to completely destroy my life will now build secure, promising futures for innocent children who actually deserve a genuine fighting chance in this harsh world. I lean back into my sturdy wooden chair, looking out over the endless expanse of rugged mountains and vibrant, changing autumn leaves. I am entirely alone up here in the quiet elevation, but I do not feel lonely. This is a profound, incredibly powerful, and completely unshackled solitude. I am finally at absolute peace and entirely free. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty, respect, and integrity do. For far too long, I allowed the title of father and husband to blind me to the predators sleeping under my own roof. I thought providing endless financial support was an act of love, but it only bred entitlement and pure malice. The absolute hardest lesson a man can learn is that sometimes the people who smile at you across the dinner table are the same ones digging your grave. Never apologize for setting boundaries, and never underestimate your own worth. When they cross the line, let them fall. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you completely trusted with your entire life? How did you actively fight back? Drop your personal story in the comments section below. If this old auditor's calculated revenge satisfied you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the truth will always win.